So, talking about solid principles, let us begin with single responsibility principle. As we might expect, the principle state that a class should have only one responsibility. Furthermore, it should only have one reason to change. To state this principle more technically, only one potential change in the software specifications should be able to affect the specifications of the class. This means that if a class is a data container, like a book class or a student class, and it has some field regarding that entity, it should change only when we change the data model. Now let us take an example. Suppose we have an invoice class which is performing three operations: calculating invoice, persisting data, and sharing invoice. In this is not a like valid example of single responsibility principle, as the invoice class need to be changed whenever there is an update in the calculation logic or the any sharing logic. To make this principle make it to bound solid principle, we can divide the invoice class and create separate classes for data persistence and sharing of invoice. So here we have created a invoice class which perform the calculation. Then we have created a separate invoice persister for persisting data, and similarly invoice transfer class for sharing of invoice. Now let us take a look at the code here. This is a simple book class with some field, nothing fancy. I'm not making field private so that you don't need to deal with the getter and setter. You can focus on the logic instead. Now let's create the invoice class which will contain the logic of creating the invoice and calculating the total price. For now, assume that our bookstore only sell books and nothing else. Here is our invoice class. If you take a look at the class, it only contains some field about invoicing and three method: calculate total method which calculate the total price, print invoice method that should print the invoice to console, and save to file method responsible for writing the invoice to a file. You should give yourself a second to think about what is the wrong with this class design before moving to the next part. Okay, so what's going on here is our class is violating single responsibility principle. The first violation is the print invoice method, which contains the printing logic. Single responsibilities principle state that our class should only have a single reason to change, and that reason should be a change in the invoice calculation. But in this architecture, if we want to change the printing format, we should need to change the class. This is why we should not have printing logic mixed with business logic in the same class. There is another method that violates the single responsibility in our class, the save to file method. It is also an extremely common mistake to mix persistent logic with the business logic. Don't just think in terms of writing to a file. It could be saving to database, making an API call, or other stuff related to persistence. So how we can fix this print function, you may ask? We can create new class for our printing and persistence logic. So we'll no longer need to modify the invoice class for these purpose. I have created two class, invoice printer and invoice persistence, and move the method for the printing and persistence to those. Like here is the invoice printer class. The printing logic is moved here. And here is the invoice persistent class. This it will take care of the persistent logic. Now our class structure obey the single responsibility principle, and every class is responsible for one aspect of our application. That sounds great. Now let's talk about the advantages of single responsibility principle here. How does this principle help us build better software? Let us see a few of its benefit. Like it can be helpful while testing. A class with one responsibility have far fewer test cases and easy to test. It will have low coupling, less functionality. In a single class will have fewer dependencies, and hence like it can be like very loosely coupled. And small classes can be organized very easily. Following the single responsibility principle is important. First of all, because many different teams can work on the same project and edit the same class for different reasons. This could lead to incompatible modules. Second, it makes version control easier. For example, say we have a persistent class that handle database operation, and we see a change in that file in the GitHub commit. By following the single responsibility principle, we'll know that it is related to storage or database related stuff. Merge conflict are another example. They appear when different teams change the same file. But if the single responsibility principle is followed, fewer conflict will appear and file will have a single reason to change. And conflict that don't exist will be easier to resolve also. So that is the benefit of using single responsibility principle. Hope you get it.